I'm Peter Lee, and this is Newsbud's China Watch. This week, hostage situation. The incoming Trump administration grabs the China Watch spotlight with provocative statements on the South China Sea and Taiwan. But first, a quick update to last week's segment on Turkey's connections with Uyghur militants. Turkish state media reported an Istanbul court had arrested 2 Chinese citizens for complicity in the New Year's Eve Reina nightclub attack that killed 39. Judging by their names, these 2 men are probably Uyghurs. By identifying these 2 men as Chinese, the Turkish government seems to be signaling its willingness to endorse the Chinese narrative, which is that the Turkish system of asylum for Uyghur refugees, which allegedly grew to include provision of false passports for fighters who went on to Syria, is unsustainable in its present form. Well, now on to this week, and the South China Sea. Rex Tillerson, the ex-Exxon CEO and Trump administration nominee for Secretary of State, testified before the House Foreign Relations Committee on January 11th. Tillerson, known in the Twitter sphere as T-Rex, roiled the waters of the South China Sea by stating that it was necessary to send a signal to China that its, quote, access, end quote, to the man-made islands it has constructed in the South China Sea will not be allowed. Here's a video clip of Tillerson's testimony.
What about this monster story of yours?
Well, it's big and terrible.
That's not really Rex Tillerson, of course, but those are actual pundits who were vocally appalled by Tillerson's apparently cavalier advocacy of a naval and air blockade of the man-made islands. In this case, I would say I'm not too concerned. The rest of Tillerson's testimony was pretty mainstream and not too World War III-ish. I think he misspoke, and I wrote an article about this for Newsbud, linked below. It was Tillerson's 5th hour of testimony, and he's got the right to flub a few lines. The most obvious alternative was that he meant to say something like China would not be allowed to militarize those islands, which would fit in with the general drift of U.S.-China policy. China President Xi Jinping made a promise to President Obama that he wouldn't, quote, militarize those islands. In Xi's own mind, and apparently with the grudging understanding of the United States, this apparently meant he would not turn those islands into offensive bases that could threaten shipping, navies, and so on. On the other hand, satellite photos show signs that the PRC is perhaps fortifying these islands, but defensively, in the spirit of Xi's discussions with Obama, with some sort of anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems. Unfortunately, the U.S. ability to complain about PRC defensive measures on these islands is limited by the fact that U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, in his wisdom, decided to organize the 2016 U.S.-Philippine Balikatan joint military exercise around a simulated amphibious assault on somebody's island. In any case, the U.S. ability to blockade an island is relatively constrained under international law. The U.S. itself doesn't take positions on third-party sovereignty disputes as a rule, let alone organize invasions to resolve them. Even in the case of the Senkakus in the East China Sea, which fall under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. has not affirmed Japanese sovereignty over those islands, which it disputes with China. In fact, a blockade would open the United States up to the charge that it is impeding freedom of navigation. That's more than awkward, since the public pretext for the U.S. injecting itself into the South China Sea dispute since 2010 was, you guessed it, upholding the principle of freedom of navigation. That's not to say the U.S. can't blockade an island if it wants to, on the grounds of national security. The U.S. Navy has buildings full of people whose only job is to explain why blockading and blowing something up is completely right, necessary, and legal, as long as it's the U.S. Navy that's doing it. If the Trump administration wants to find a justification for blockading a Chinese man-made island, they'll do it. But I don't think they want to. The Chinese, who pushed back immediately, apparently don't believe it either. They said they were going to wait and see. I think Tillerson just misspoke. And that's what a Trump transition team member told Reuters on Background. The waters were muddied, of course, by an official authorized to speak on behalf of the transition team, telling Reuters that Tillerson did not misspeak, and that statement was made in the exact same article. Bottom line, in my opinion, a new American administration is always seen as gut check time for U.S. resolve in standing up to China. Once Tillerson made that statement, the Trump people aren't going to walk it back and look weak on China. Whether they actually go ahead and blockade a Chinese-held island, well, that's another story. At the same time, it's clear that the Trump administration wants to draw a bright line between the relatively moderate, legalistic, and circumspect Obama-China policy and a new, chestier, more assertive Trump policy. It seems that one way Trump hopes to deflect accusations that he's in the tank for Putin and Russia is to be tough on China. And it looks like the place to start being tough on China is probably going to be Taiwan. Over the weekend, Trump told the Wall Street Journal that all elements of America's China policy were in play, including the One China policy, by which the United States withholds formal diplomatic recognition from Taiwan and does official government-to-government dealings exclusively with the government in Beijing. As Trump put it, everything is under negotiation, including One China. If One China policy is on the table, that means Taiwan independence is on the table. I'd like to pause at this moment to address anxious and angry never-Trumpers. Never-Trumpers. In my opinion, the way to understand Trump is not as a bigoted, unstable psycho-baby desperate for validation and approval. Maybe he is all those things, but the key to understand Trump is, in my opinion, he's a deal maker and a hostage taker. He identifies things you care about that you can't completely control, but he can mess up, and he threatens them. So you're forced to deal with them, like Obamacare. What does that mean for China? In my opinion, it means moving away from the Obama administration's focus. The Obama doctrine identified all the wonderful things America cares about: human rights, internet freedom, the principled international order, as we like to call it, and insisted that China care about them too, even if China didn't want to care. Trump, in my opinion, turns that paradigm on its head. The Trump doctrine is about finding something China really cares about, grabbing onto it, and making China scream. That's Taiwan. Taiwan is the most prominent diplomatic and political vulnerability for China. Unlike the other restive PRC claims, Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, Taiwan is beyond the PRC's administrative control, and it's drifting further and further away. When the PRC and the U.S. concluded the Shanghai Communique in 1972 and adopted the One China formula, Taiwan was still ruled by Kuomintang apparatchiks who had fled the mainland with Chiang Kai-shek after the defeat by the communists in 1949. They occupied Taiwan, ruled it under martial law, and brutally suppressed indigenous political and cultural expression. Thinking and hoping that Taiwan could be reunited with the mainland as a conclusion to the Civil War was a remote but feasible expectation at that time. But in the intervening years, Taiwan democratized, while on the mainland the CCP massacred Tiananmen protesters and screwed up the one country, two systems political endgame in Hong Kong. Parallel with, and in some ways independent to these political forces, a distinct identity as Taiwanese, opposed to Chinese, has been emerging naturally on the island as the mainland generation dies off. Today, reunification with the mainland is politically dead on Taiwan. Independence dominates the mindset, particularly among the young. Polls are polls, need to be taken with a grain of salt. But as a recent survey in Taiwan indicated, a solid majority of under 40s considered themselves only Taiwanese and not Chinese, and supported independence by a margin of 4-1. For the time being, most Taiwanese support the current status quo of peace and quiet and economic ties with the mainland. But the poll reported, quote, 43% of the under 40 generation would support independence, even if it meant China would attack Taiwan under the risk of war, end quote. In case of a conflict, in other words, we can expect significant numbers of Taiwanese would rally around the flag. And here's what that Taiwan flag looks like, since we don't get to see it very often. Taiwan independence activists don't like this flag, by the way, because it's the old Sun Yat-sen KMT Republic of China flag brought over from the mainland. An independent Taiwan flag might look more like this. Chinese nationalists don't like this flag because they consider it a nod to the Japanese imperial chrysanthemum seal. And maybe they've got a point. The nationalists' complaint has some plausibility because another headache for the PRC is that the historical orientation of indigenous Taiwanese is not west toward the mainland as much as north to Japan, who is China's strategic adversary. Japan ruled Taiwan from 1895 until 1945. In contrast to the genocidal brutality of Japanese rule over Korea, rule over Taiwan was relatively benign and is remembered fondly by Taiwanese of the pre-1949 generation, that is to say, those who had immigrated from southern China in centuries past. Additionally, in the last period of colonial rule, from 1936 to 1945, Japan moved to a policy of encouraging assimilation of the people of Taiwan into the Japanese polity, very much along the lines of what occurred in Okinawa, another racially and politically distinct colonized entity. The Japanese government encouraged speaking of Japanese, use of Japanese names, and service in the Japanese military forces. The first indigenous president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, now 92 years old, is described as the spiritual head of the Taiwan independence movement. He speaks Japanese, not Mandarin Chinese as his second language. Lee's brother died in the service of the Japanese Empire, and so his name is inscribed at the notorious Yasukuni Shrine. Lee made a point of visiting the shrine in 2007, which naturally gave the Chinese conniptions. In 2015, Lee also referred to Japan as Taiwan's motherland. Lee has also maintained ties with Japanese ultranationalists like Shintaro Ishihara, who despise China, harbor nostalgia for the glories of the pre-war era, and would be happy to welcome and assist the return of an independent Taiwan into the bosom of the Japanese family. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen is also of non-mainlander stock and comes from the pro-independence wing of the Taiwan political spectrum, the Democratic People's Party, or DPP. She has actively promoted Japanese investment as an alternative to the mainland in order to reduce Taiwan's economic and political vulnerability to China. Current Japanese Prime Minister Abe, for his part, has characterized Taiwan as a friend that Japan should cherish. So, pretty much all the demographic, social, political, and economic trends are pushing today's Taiwan away from mainland China. A big factor in bucking that trend and maintaining the status quo between the PRC and Taiwan is America's adherence as a global norm setter to the one China policy. In other words, America's got leverage, and Donald Trump's threatening to use it. I don't think that necessarily means egging on Taiwan to declare independence, although, believe it or not, that's what Donald Rumsfeld was doing clandestinely in the early years of the George W. Bush administration. It's up to Tsai Ing-wen, not Donald Trump, to decide how quickly and how far to push that envelope. Independence is an existential issue for Taiwan, guaranteeing an immediate economic crisis and perhaps a military one as well. Decisions along and across this line will not be taken lightly, and they'll be made by the government and people of Taiwan, not Donald Trump. And these decisions will not, I think, be taken with the misconception that Donald Trump has Taiwan's back. If Trump regards the Taiwan issue primarily as a pawn in his dealings with Beijing, he will sacrifice that pawn quickly, casually, and callously if it suits his purpose. In any case, even if the United States decided it wanted to give Taiwan all the missiles and submarines it needs to credibly deter PRC military retaliation for a declaration of independence, I'd guess that's a 10-year project at least. In other words, it's not going to happen during the Donald Trump era. But the United States can upgrade its relationships with Taiwan in ways that inconvenience China. This might include sale of defensive equipment, including perhaps even the China-detested THAAD, or THAAD, the Theater High Altitude Missile Defense System, which would expand the capabilities of the U.S.-centered anti-ballistic missile network in Asia. It is, I dare say, not well known that a key element of U.S.-Taiwan military cooperation, a long-range radar system facing the mainland with a range of 3,000 kilometers and a cost of $1.4 billion, has already been operational in Taiwan for 3 years. The U.S. could also signal its encouragement of Taiwan's attempts to buy modern diesel submarines from Japan or Europe, something that the U.S. has discouraged up until now because of intense PRC opposition. DPP Affairs insider and journalist J. Michael Cole reported that Japan had stated it would not enter into discussions concerning submarine business as long as Taiwan was under the rule of the mainland-friendly KMT regime of Ma Ying-jeou. Now that Ma is gone and Tsai is in, Japan would probably be ready to talk. Tsai and other high-level Taiwanese officials could also be welcomed by Trump and by the leaders, perhaps, of the countries allied with the United States. Or Trump might do exactly nothing. Here's what RNC Chair Reince Priebus said on a Sunday morning talk show after the Tillerson testimony and the Trump interview. There are no plans to change the one China policy, but certainly that policy is on the table if China doesn't also come to the table and work with us on trade, work with us on the South China Sea and what's happening there. If Reince Priebus is to be believed, or more correctly, if he is considered to have any more insight into the intentions of the Trump administration than marginalized journos and sideline pundits, the Trump position is this: if the People's Republic of China persists in its undesirable envelope-pushing activities in the South China Sea, stealing U.S. drones, sailing around its aircraft carrier, dallying with the Philippines, maybe thinking of more island building, and doesn't give Trump a few wins on trade and investment, well, nice fake Taiwan province you got there. Hate to see anything happen to it. Right now, Taiwan is loving it, especially Tsai and the DPP, whose popularity has been flagging in recent months. Here's the way Taiwan's famous animators lay out the Tsai-Trump relationship.
蔡对于台美更深层的合作关系表达了期待。川普也向蔡英文于今年初赢得选战表达祝贺。不管川普是故意或是不小心引起这场风暴，对台湾来说都是好事。你问我中国方面的反应和说法，谁管他？ Taiwan #1。
That's all for this week. Thanks for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to newsbud.com, where you'll find exclusive content available only to the Newsbud community. I'm Peter Lee for Newsbud's China Watch.